Nameless heroes exist throughout the world of Dark Souls. Crestfallen knights, sorcerers from esteemed academies, vagabonds, and even slaves. But the most important nameless hero of each installment is of course our protagonist, be it Ashen One, bearer of the curse, or even chosen undead. Our protagonist is more than just a vehicle to experience this world, as our protagonist is always a catalyst for the story's very progression, and despite each installment having something of a cyclical nature, where endings bear little meaning to its sequences, contrary to popular belief, our story as protagonists hold a deep importance to the narrative of the game as a whole. They mirror the forces of the world in each game. Dark Souls is a game where we are always David in a Goliath hero's journey, and despite the monumental achievements of each protagonist reaching the endpoint of each game, their stories are often lost in the sequels. So today I'm making a very special video. We'll be following the story of each protagonist, explored like never before. And as you've come to expect of my channel, we'll be using every ounce of lore to understand who was the most powerful of each protagonist. And yes, I mean each protagonist. This means ranking each ending that holds materially different power levels in the entire trilogy. You may see some endings having been omitted, but these are omitted purely on the basis that there is no material difference in the power level they assume at the end of their story. As you have come to know by now, my videos, while grounded in power scaling, are in truth world-building exercises for us to explore the game's universe by uncovering all the relevant lore and then some. So whether you've come to learn who is the strongest protagonist, or just want to live the stories of our great protagonists, you're in for a special one either way. Like always, these videos are researched, written, edited, and recorded all by myself. So if you're feeling generous, please like, subscribe, and hype the video to your heart's content. But with that being said, let's follow the story of our first protagonist on this list. Dark Souls 2 differs from Dark Souls 1 and 3, as it doesn't tell us grand stories of change or great beginnings. In fact, the core theme of Dark Souls 2 is futility. It exists in the series to reinforce the insignificance of humans in the trajectory of this universe. But behind this core theme of futility, in the grand narrative of the franchise, Dark Souls 2 has a freedom unlike any other installment of the series. Dark Souls 2 can tell us the stories of the lives that happened between the grand narratives of the first and final installment. It can explore the story and trauma of a father going hollow and his daughter unable to even recognise him. It has the liberty to explore the story of a crestfallen knight fed up with having to struggle with the world's dialectic, finding meaning outside of Dark Souls' binary conflict. Crestfallen Soldan can tell us about the importance of Majula's ambience, and it can actually mean something to our protagonist on a material level. Because in Dark Souls 2, we aren't a chosen undead, we are the bearer of the curse. There's an intentionality about the naming convention here, an intentionality that shouldn't minimize the importance of this protagonist. It should empower its place in the franchise as the most ordinary of the series, and thus the most relatable. Our protagonist wasn't chosen or granted illusions of grandeur. Rather, we learn from the first cutscene, we've entered this world, we've entered Drang Lake in desperation. Our ailing mind has pushed us to Drang Lake in search of a cure to mend it. Oscar of Astora isn't here to tell us thou who are undead are chosen. Rather, on the inverse, the beginning of our protagonist's journey follows the monologue of an old woman teasing us about the inevitability of our mental deterioration and how countless people like us have ventured down this path to only find pain and anguish. We're not a prophetic hero, we're not even misled to believe we can be such a thing. We are, in the most brutal and, well, depressing way, a victim. And soon as we follow the route to a mysterious land on an inkling of retaining our sanity, with a thump, we arrive in Drang Lake. Our protagonist comes to a hut at the end of some winding roads to be greeted by Stroan, the mouthpiece of a group of old firekeepers.
People come here for the same reason, to break the curse. You're no different, I should think. Doesn't stand a chance. Well, you never know.
This encounter only fills our protagonist with more dread. We are eventually put to ease after we move forward and scurry through some branches to be met by the vista of Majula. A pocket of serenity leads to a chance encounter with the Emerald Herald.
Are you the next monarch? Or merely a pawn of fate? Bearer of the curse, I will remain by your side till this frail hope shatters. Take this with you. May it ease your journey. Go on and see the king. He who made Drangleic what it once was. He who peered at the essence of the soul. King Vendrick.
Our protagonist rightfully senses something special about this woman. She goes on to offer some advice, encouraging us to fight through our upcoming hardship, as it will be the precondition for the strength required to truly overcome the trials of Drangleic, and by proxy retain our mind. With clear direction, the bearer of the curse sets off in search of this mysterious king, and the so-called 4 ineffable souls that binds the power required for an audience with said monarch. The path of least resistance takes the protagonist through the Forest of the Fallen Giants and the Cardinal Tower, a historical battlefield strewn with dead soldiers and tree-like giants, remnants of the war once waged by Vendrick, our monarch in question. Without realising it, we are already picking up the pieces of history Vendrick had left behind, as if we are this monarch given a fresh start. Soon the bearer of the curse is flown to a Bastille after confronting the pursuer, a hunter of undead, a knight of a region known as Alcan, incredibly proficient in weaponry, and ironically consumed by the very same darkness that represents Hollowing itself. The people of Drangleic are not just fighting outside forces, but they are also fighting amongst themselves and with themselves. This Bastille is a far stretch from the sun of Majula and filled to the brim with undead who have completely hollowed, and what seems to be their captors, made up of guards and automatons in the form of sentinels. Challenges the bearer of the curse overcomes, granting them passage to the Sinner's Rise, where a petrified man stands in a cell. Thankfully, the bearer of the curse is able to dispel this petrification and in return reanimates this man. He calls himself Strayed of Olafis. Up to this point, we've heard many names of many areas in Drangleic, but Olafis isn't one of them, as Strayed is not from this time. In fact, he's a relic of a bygone era, an era that preceded Drangleic's construction, a kingdom now lost to time, but a kingdom that may give us insight into the nature of Drangleic itself and the nature of our protagonist's journey to greatness. Stray tells us the Lost Bastille was created with the purpose of housing undead. It was an attempt to retain order in a kingdom that was befalling the undead curse. Stray tells us this curse was unstoppable, eventually leading kingdoms to ashes and only granted a new lease of life after a new flame was reignited. We as the player know this well as the ritual of rekindling the first flame from the first game, but our protagonist is only now made aware of such a ritual existing. While Strayed remains spotted about what he divulges, the bearer of the curse is finally putting together the purpose of the Emerald Herald's prophecy. Perhaps we're not here to be granted an audience with the king, but to bring an end to his stagnant rule, to usurp Drangleic from its ashes. Once again, we are walking a path that seems to have already been walked before. Nevertheless, the bearer of the curse marches on, until they are face to face with the lost sinner, and the spiritual succession to the immensely powerful, but ultimately twisted soul of Izalith, a primordial lord that once stood beside Gwyn during the War of Ancients, as they sought to bring upon the world the Age of Fire, an event of immense mythical proportion, and the stories of which carrying strength even myths can't quantify. However, there's something vastly different about the form Izalith's soul has taken in Dark Souls 2 as it does in Dark Souls 1. The Bed of Chaos in the first game is nearing the height of Izalith's power after she had transformed into the Bed of Chaos, seeking to create a First Flame of her own as a means of circumventing the waning of the true First Flame. The true First Flame bound the era known as the Age of Fire, and the material condition that ordained gods' rule over men, and the gods were desperate to not let this go, as it also symbolised the strength they used to first justify their place in this world. We know the Chaos Flame in particular was involved in a protracted war with Gwyn after malforming into an antagonistic entity towards Gwyn's own rule, appearing as a force against the First Flame itself, rather than one that mimicked and preserved its greatness in perpetuity. While we only witness remnants of this war, we know it would lead to Izalith having to retreat to a corner of the world, and the demon race left to pick up the pieces and create a small society that would inevitably weaken with time. The Lost Sinner, in the same breath, unlike the Bed of Chaos, doesn't represent Izalith's twisted soul in its prime, but rather is represented as a self-flagellating sinner, showing the internal hatred Izalith must have had for her hubris in attempting to mimic the First Flame and putting her in opposition to her once fellow comrade Gwyn. The Lost Sinner is immensely dim in a literal sense, and despite sourcing her strength from a soul of fire and chaos, fire is not the core theme, nor does fire even represent itself as a material force in the main game fight. This core theme of primordial Lord Souls and their successions in Dark Souls 2 being smaller and warped bastardizations is intentional. Once again, as this game's primary framing is under the theme of futility. History repeats itself first as tragedy and second as farce. Dark Souls 2 represents most the farce of this cycle. Regardless, a battle ensues until the Lost Sinner falls, and from her, a soul emerges that envelops our protagonist in immense strength. Perhaps this is the power the Emerald Herald spoke of back in Majula. However, before we're able to return to Majula, and as we strike a special bonfire, something feels different in this world. On our return to Majula, the Emerald Herald lets us know we are on the right path, and this one soul represents the first of 4 we will have to obtain. Sparing no time and a new spring in our step, we carry on. Our protagonist makes their way down a well to the Black Gulch until we face the Rotten, the successor to Nito's soul, and just as you'd expect, this soul is represented not as the legendary First of Death and source of the miasma that literally imploded ancient everlasting dragons, but yet another sad bastardization. It's represented as a conglomerated mass of corpses, a stark difference from the refined structure of Nito's skeletal form. And just like the Last Sinner, this miasma power inherent to Nito is nowhere to be seen, relying mostly on bashing the protagonist with a butcher's knife, a stark difference to the legendary Gravelord sword. It's as if Dark Souls 2 is purposely misremembering the true power of the primordial lords, proving once again the farcical nature of a cycle forced upon the world by Gwyn. Duke's dear Freya is next, a spider that harboured the soul of Seath, a part of Gwyn's own Soul of Sunlight granted to Seath in the early construction of Lordran. Freya's a little different to the others, however, as Freya seems to represent Seath's succession best, seemingly harbouring the everlasting scales on her body of the dragon Seath so desperately sought to replicate, and even the sorcery that was so volatile that it could create an ecosystem that would envelop an entire region. It can be argued that unlike the other lords, Seath's life was always one of futility and betrayal, even in the first game, as his story revolved around his anger for being different to his peers due to his lack of scales. And even once standing atop the mountain of corpses of his kin he helped Gwyn eradicate, he would still spend the rest of his natural life seeking to replicate their immortality. With one to go, we march through the Iron Keep, a kingdom on the brink of collapse due to the hubris of its monarch. This monarch's greed and undeterred self-preservation represented itself as a demon born of fire, the Smelter Demon. And on the death of the Smelter Demon, we are given our entrance to the kingdom's throne room. The throne is vacant and the room is empty, but from its spire, our protagonist spies a small structure. On the approach to this structure, something stirs, and from the lava, the Iron King rises. We know the Iron King to harbour the final piece of the puzzle, the final soul required for an audience with Drangleic own residing king. So our protagonist fights and the Iron King falls, but with his death, we are granted a soul that feels more special than the rest. Not special due to its power alone, but special because its heritage seems intimately linked to someone once more significant than the others. This soul, as we learn, is the soul of Gwyn, the soul of sunlight, the essence of the architect of this very era in time, the Age of Fire. There's irony in how the Iron King's downfall was hubris and greed in the accumulation of iron to build a kingdom he believed eternal, just like Gwyn believed the Age of Fire to be eternal, only to burden the world in a cycle of oppressive, deteriorating conditions. The Iron King's story is of course far more tragic. As Gwyn's bastardization, he represented greed to the absolute worst degree. Enough so, even his closest allies had left him, and eventually an automaton created in the kingdom's image, literally turning against the Iron King and burying him deep below the molten iron of his own undoing. With 4 of the great twisted souls in tow, the bearer of the curse finally makes their way to the final special bonfire. But this time, something unexpected happens.
No one has come this far, not for a very long while. Young Harlow, do you wish to shed this curse? Then accept the fate of your ilk and face the trials that await you. Unless you have already joined the Crestfallen. Young Harlow, there are but 2 paths. Inherit the order of this world, or destroy it. But only a true monarch can make such a choice. Very few indeed have come even this far. And yet your journey is far from over. Half-grown Hollow, have you what it takes? Truly? Young Hollow, seek after Vendrick. He who almost became a true monarch. The Vendrick is certain to guide your way. Fledgling Hollow, may we meet again?
Uldir, brother to Vendrick, the king of the land and the target of our campaign, has made it clear there is a route to shedding this curse, and it will, just as we feared from Strahd's own words, require us to take control of Drangleic, and subsequently the world's future by taking from Vendrick his position and asserting our own will upon this world. We are given Uldir's blessings to seek out Vendrick, and with the power to confront the ruler in tow, we set off for Castle Drangleic. Finally, as we set facing the staircase to the kingdom, our protagonist remembers where the journey began, and without a moment's notice, also recognises the woman who set us on our way, the Emerald Herald. After a brief exchange of further encouragement, the bearer of the curse takes the first steps towards the castle, and can't help but wonder how such a fortified kingdom of this scale could so easily be undone by anything. Where is the king, and why was he showing such apathy to his deteriorating kingdom? A question that would be promptly answered as we fight our way to his throne room, only to find his throne vacant, and a pale woman sitting beside it, waiting, as if she was expecting an audience with us.
You have fought admirably on your journey, cursed undead. I am Nashandra, Queen of Dranglake. A true monarch carries the weight of their souls. The last king of this land, King Vendrick, as he was called. He found the strength to rule his people, and when the undead were born, cursed, he found more strength to face them. But in the end, he never took the true throne. Visit Vendrick.
Vendrick, the king of this land, was much like us. He too came to this land with nothing, and upon conquering 4 lords, used their strength to build Dranglake. And when the Hollowing Curse began to encroach upon his kingdom, he left. He, just as Strayed had mentioned for Kingdoms Gone, chose against steering a new era. He is responsible for prolonging this curse, and we are convinced to be responsible for taking this mantle from him to put this stagnation to an end. Battling through the final ranks of Dranglake's knights and confronting the Looking Glass Knight, one of Gwyn's most faithful champions, we descend onto Amana. Disrupting its sung serenity, we finally enter the undead crypt, and we're met by a familiar being. Aldir has returned and is convinced of our capability, but in a similar breath grants us a warning. Do we even understand the nature of the actions we are led to believe are true? Or is there a much grander history predetermining the lives of humans ordained? We as a player of course know this as referring to Gwyn's actions in binding humanity to cyclically preserve the Age of Fire as a desperate attempt at preserving his own age. With new lingering doubt, the bearer of the curse marches on, and at the end of the crypts is met by Velstadt, Vendrick's most decorated and faithful knight. He has clearly been here for a long time, his body consumed by the dark natural to these crypts. The nature of the time gone made most apparent when we best Velstadt and finally seek an audience with the exiled monarch. But as we descend the final steps, we are met with a gut-wrenching realization. Vendrick is no more. What is left is the husk of his body, now aimlessly wandering the crypt. Beside him lay his kingly attire, and upon them the bearer of the curse finds a ring, the king's seal. The Emerald Herald conveniently close by, giving us direction towards the king's gate, but offers an eerie piece of dialogue that reminds us of Aldir's previous comments.
This ring is the symbol of the king. Use it to gain passage through the king's gate and venture to the far east and seek the home of the dragon. To the far east. Bearer of the curse, if you are to be the next monarch, then one day you will walk those grounds without really knowing why.
With the words of the Emerald Herald and Aldir now setting in the bearer of the curse's mind, it's not hard to imagine our protagonist fearing he is walking the same path as Vendrick, and if at the end of it all Vendrick was left a lifeless husk, is there any real reason to prolong our inevitable outcome? Is this all futile? Using the King's Seal and passing through Aldir's Manor, we finally make it to the Dragon's Eyrie, and our final conversation with Aldir, who now formally announces his name and link to Vendrick, and it wouldn't be long until we are given an audience with the ancient dragon who grants us the Ashen Mist Heart, a key that gives passage to the memories of the giants and the final piece to the puzzle required to enter the Throne of Want and the captain's seat in renewing order to Drang Lake. As our protagonist searches through the memories left behind by the giants, we learn quickly stories of Vendrick's greatness may be far more nuanced than originally believed, as he once stood as a belligerent force that waged a preemptive war against the giants in their homeland. The element of surprise would lead to the destruction of their capital, and Vendrick to steal their society's most valuable asset, the giant's kinship, a means to control and create golems, an integral piece of Drang Lake's construction, and a truth that binds Vendrick's legacy in greed and insecurity. And much like Gwyn and the Iron King, greed would often come with karmic retribution. For Vendrick, however, this came in two separate ways. The first was through his wife Nashandra's secret ploy to force Vendrick down a path of darkness. We'll go into this soon enough. And a second was a retaliatory invasion by the Giant Lord, a mirror image of Vendrick seeking to strike Drang Lake as they had once been struck themselves. Our protagonist in this moment relives the memory of a great champion that slew the Giant Lord in Vendrick's stead, but with his defeat came the truth that Vendrick's kingdom was fragile, marking a turning point for his own insecurity, only solidified further as soon would follow a hollowing curse, a far more transient threat to Drang Lake's hegemony. As our bearer of the curse holds in their hands the giant's kinship, the Throne of Want is finally open to them, and as our protagonist defeats the ancient defenders of the throne, once great guardians of an age so far in the past, their armour and weaponry are alien to this world, the bearer of the curse realises he was followed.
Brave undead, you have proven yourself to me.
Nashandra was not what she seemed. She is an entity of the dark, a portion of an age-old deity that once resided beside the gods, the furtive pygmy, which was later represented as Manus in its enraged form. We'll save Manus' story for the Chosen Undead of Dark Souls 1, but what is important to know here is that in the world of Dark Souls, darkness, while initially framed as an inherently evil force, actually represents the heritage of humans. The Dark Soul, once coveted by the furtive pygmy, stood in stark contrast to the other three Lord Souls of Fire held by Izalith, Nito and Gwyn. It was a reminder that the Age of Fire, much like the Age of Ancients, had an expiry date, and there would come a time those born of darkness, those born of the furtive pygmy, such as that of pygmies themselves and later humans, would rise above those of fire, those who believed themselves to be gods. But without spoiling the story of the Chosen Undead, we know Gwyn locked the world into an eternal dialectic of struggle, forcing his own will upon the same nature that allowed his own era to succeed the Age of Ancients. He tricked those of the Dark Soul to accept a sign that literally bound their soul to fire and would burn his own flesh to ensure nature's stagnation. Since this moment, the world of Dark Souls was locked in the purgatory of two factions, darkness and thus humanity, and the Age of Fire and thus gods. We, as the bearer of the curse, are a synthesis of this very dialectic. We are inherently human, but also the bearer of the soul of gods. And as Nashandra, who much like the four Lord Soul's successors, a bastardized and smaller part of the soul of Manus, falls to the bearer of the curse's power, we are granted, if Uldir is to be trusted, an illusion of choice. Do we choose darkness, or do we choose fire? And no matter what we do in this moment, it doesn't really matter, because this will all happen again. The bearer of the curse's story is a less significant retelling of a much greater story, told thousands of times already. It is precisely for this reason Dark Souls 2's main ending doesn't even give us as a player a choice at the throne, because there is no material difference. If even the one to dethrone Gwyn from the first flame, having slain the true primordial gods, could not change things, Why would the bearer of a curse, having harbored the dwindled and bastardized souls of those same gods, make any difference? I said the bearer of the curse had no choice, but in reality there is another option: apathy. Our protagonist, now sitting upon their throne, looks through the closing doors and asks themselves, perhaps it would have been better to just walk away. As the doors shut, the bearer of the curse dreams of another world, and thus their clock is reversed to the moment the giant's kinship was retrieved. And instead of making their way to the throne, they ask themselves, why did Vendrick, standing with the power we do now, choose to just walk away at this final moment? On our way to the crypt this time, our protagonist stumbles upon a cave and within finds the crown of Vendrick. This is more assurance our audience with the king must happen. Retracing Vendrick's steps to the undead crypt, our protagonist walks to Vendrick's garbs and seeks answers from Vendrick himself.
Seeker of fire, coveter of the throne. I am Vendrick, ruler of Drang Lake. Seeker of fire, deliverer of crowns. What do you see in the flames? Find the crowns and your own answers. The crowns hold the strength of lords from times long past. Seek adversity, as befits you, seeker of fire, coveter of the throne. Seeker of fire, conqueror of dark. I too sought fire once. With fire, they say, a true king can harness the curse. A lie, but I knew no better. Seeker of fire, you know not the depth of dark within you. Dark was seen as a curse. Shadow is not cast, but born of fire. And the brighter the flame, the deeper the shadow. Inherit fire and harness the dark. Such is the calling of a true leader.
This is all the assurance we needed. There is another path we can take, a path that will guide our protagonist to the three kingdoms ruled over by the reflections of Vendrick and a deeper understanding of what it means to be a monarch, or perhaps the futility of assuming such a role. Our first stop would take our protagonist to the land of Shulver, a land overrun by poison and a dragon terrorizing the region. Retracing the steps of knights bearing the sigil of a dragon, we learn Shulver used to be a deeply religious territory, and at the point of their worship resided a slumbering dragon. Murals cover Shulver, referencing this symbiotic relationship between the city and the dragon. Shulver was organised like any ordinary kingdom, a king ruled over with a queen by their side. However, much like Nashandra was for Vendrick, Alana, the squalid king's wife, was also a part of Manus, a being born of the dark soul, shattered after Manus' death. However, unlike Drang Lake, we learn Alana was clearly far more successful. Her role as queen well overshadowed that of the king's, even enough so that the king's name had been lost to time. Her rule would bind Shulver's culture to the practice of singing ominous songs to appease the slumbering dragon. While initially believed to be songs of peace, turns out to be the very songs that would inflict the slumbering dragon with poison. Elana's soul tells us, this child of dark accompanies the dragon, slowly amassing souls in anticipation of the coming day of vengeance. Poison is natural to her repertoire, making clear she was harnessing her own power through the dragon, in anticipation of a time where its ire would be an extension of herself. This concept of a Dark Queen related to Manus seeking to use greater powers in proxy is seen in Vendrick, and as discussed was the initial plan Nashandra had laid out for Vendrick before he realised and left to avert Nashandra's influence. Shulva represents a version of Drangleic that allowed Nashandra's influence to take full form. Ilana's influence is represented by a deep-rooted poison, an infliction of soul. This would all come to a head when Shulva would be contested by the Drakeblood Knights, missionaries who believed the blood of dragons held great power. Not an entirely left-field stream of thought, as this is also precisely what Uldir had initially believed too, hence his creation of the false ancient dragon. Yorg's men would raid Shulva and eventually awaken the slumbering dragon, now known to us as Sin, by striking him in the abdomen, only for the deep poison of Ilana to spill and wreak havoc on both the knights and even the kingdom. Our protagonist makes their way through Shulva and eventually is face to face with Ilana, her true colours shown as a poisonous blight. The protagonist is found asking themselves if this is the future Vendrick fled from. Perhaps he was right. If the choice of the throne sat between the Age of Fire, repressive to the conditions of humanity, and an Age of Dark twisted by the nature of what humanity has come to represent in the Dark Sisters, then perhaps to abandon the throne altogether is not such a bad decision. Reservations in their mind, Ilana is slain and eventually Sin is confronted. Sin's power is monumental, a synthesis of an ancient dragon closely aligned to the lineage of the true everlasting dragons, and the power of Manas's twisted darkness bloating him with poison. As our protagonist finishes what Yorg had started, proving themselves as above the power of both factions, a crown is found, the crown of the Sunken King, a symbol of our triumph over our first trial, a trial that proves we can be more than the vengefulness of our dark soul and what it seeks us to be. Having gathered a portion of Manas's great dark soul and the crown of Shulva, our protagonist moves forward and onto the Land of Iron, the Broom Tower, a masterwork of machinery built on the greed of the old Iron King. Broom Tower was the Iron Keep's shadow, a neglected factory of iron now abandoned after the demise of the old Iron King. As we make our way through, we learn in his stead a new presence has established itself here, Nadalia, a dark sister not unlike Nashandra and Ilana. However, she was kingless, she came too late. The old Iron King had perished far before she arrived in these lands, and thus she had nothing to latch onto to preserve her own fragile life. As we make our way through the Broom Tower, Nadalia's whispers echo. There is an intentional bit of dialogue that proclaims us as having finally returned. It's important to remember our bearer of the curse has to have claimed the old Iron King's soul prior to entering this land, the only king we face prior to the events of the 3 DLCs. Once again, this is intentional, as the story of this crown puts us in the shoes of the old Iron King. Nadalia, sensing within us the presence of the monarch she initially came to latch onto, has led her to placing us in the same predicament Vendrick was in with Nashandra, and of course the Sunken King was in with Ilana. As we navigate through the tower, we even come to the possession of a scepter, the same scepter that would cause the Iron King to enter a death spiral of greed. And before we know it, we are up against Raim, now known as the Fume Knight. Raim was once a faithful knight of Vendrick, a peer to Velstart who had become skeptical of Vendrick's relationship with Nashandra and the darkness enveloping Drangleic. At some point, Raim's vocal criticism would pinch the nerve of Velstart, who would turn on his brother-in-arms for his doubt to Vendrick's role. Velstart would best Raim, setting Raim down a path to seek more power, a power he finds in Nadalia. Accepting her darkness within him, initially as an attempt to gain the power he required to defeat Velstart, but instead finding a peace within himself that would have him pledge his body and soul to Nadalia's protection. Raim is an incredibly important final hurdle during this DLC, as he not only represents Nadalia's power, but also acts as a mirror image of what we could have become if we accepted Nadalia's seduction, and lived just as the Sunken King had with Ilana, and how Vendrick did with Nashandra in the early days, notably during his persuaded invasion of the Land of Giants. While Shulva taught us the means to overcome the power of Ilana's vengeful darkness, the Broom Tower, and thus the Fume Knight, teaches us a means of rejecting it from a place of favour. The fume night reflects to us a deep, peaceful future bound to darkness, sterilization of our ambitions. And with Raim's fall, we prove we, unlike many monarchs before, can violently reject this. And in the rubble of Nadalia's corpse, now left lifeless after Raim's death, we find the crown of the Iron King and another portion of the ancient Manas's dark soul. And finally, our protagonist moves forward and finds themselves in the final trial. Frozen Elaim Lois. Elaim Lois is a little different, and yes, while currently resided over by a sister of the dark known as Alsana, her relationship with the king of this realm is far more nuanced. We learn modern Elaim Lois was influenced heavily by a man known as the Ivory King, a Ferocian knight known to stand up for the weak and always found at the front line of battles to enact this duty. We learn Ferosa would one day dissolve due to a protracted war with their neighbours, and a great majority of Ferocians would become sellswords, commodifying their most notable trait to maintain themselves as vagabonds. The Ivory King, however, chose against this career, for he was bound by a moral compass that sought to defend the weak. Thus, it was under this treatise he would create a new kingdom to replace the old, Elaim Lois. Built on top of this lasting remnant of the Bed of Chaos, the Ivory King knew only he was of the aptitude to keep this existential threat at bay. Bound by his ambition to protect, he created a kingdom atop this terror, housing his own throne at the gates of the Chaos Flames and vowing to be the first and final defense against whatever may emerge. Bringing his faithful knights, he organised a council of talented warriors to watch over the flames, and did so with such great efficiency that the Burnt Ivory King's actions may be the sole reason we literally do not encounter a single demon from the Bed of Chaos in Dark Souls 2, a stark contrast between the first game where almost half the bosses are related to the Bed of Chaos. However, as was the case for Shulver, Drangleic and even the Broom Tower, the great kings in Dark Souls 2 often find themselves in the company of a less than ordinary queen. The Ivory King was no exception, as he too had become intertwined with an aspect of Manus in Alsana. Unlike his contemporaries, however, the Ivory King knew of Alsana's darkness, and due to his underlying morality in being a protector of those who could not protect themselves, he sheltered the queen and bare the weight of both the flames of chaos and the darkness of the abyss all at once. It's clear our final journey to the final crown requested by Vendrick was not one of domination over the darkness or even the rejection of its corrupting embrace. Rather, it was to learn a lesson in humility and coexistence. The Ivory King's soul was immense, but as we learn, the souls that burn the brightest cast the biggest shadow, and either at the realization of his hollowing or the power of his dwindling soul, he cast himself into the flames of chaos to forever be bound by it, and use his will as a direct force to keep it at bay. Alsana, unlike her sisters, although initially intended to use the king as a proxy for her own homecoming, instead revered her lord immensely, casting off the sum of her own parts, and in the wake of her king's absence, taking charge of Elaim Lois not as a Queen of Dark, but as an extension of her king's legacy, locking the gates of the kingdom in an avalanche of ice, forever keeping in the terrors that would one day come to be. Our journey has us take the Ivory King's position, rally his troops, and eventually confront and grant peace to the Ivory King for his immense sacrifice. Soon enough, we enter the Bed of Chaos to confront the Ivory King's now burnt troop of loyal followers, until he emerges from the flame itself. Carrying the legacy of a champion who once stood down not only the Bed of Chaos but the source of Izalith's power and demon race so single-handedly not a single demon is present in the wider game, our bearer of the curse finally brings the behemoth down, granting the king his well-deserved final rest, and us his soul of immense strength. And in our final moments in Eleum Lois, Altsana is not angry that the source of her protection is no more. Rather, on the contrary of her inherent existence as a small corrupting portion of Manus' soul, thanks us in benevolence and sheds upon us her own soul to be reunited with the Ivory King, coexisting within us. Having learned to overcome the dark from Shulver, rejecting its sterilizing peace from the Broom Tower, and a means to coexist with the dark from Eleum Lois, and now empowered by the soul and stories of three kings that mirrored portions of Vendrick's own story, we are finally ready to return to Vendrick with a new perspective. Our journey has been long, and much time has passed since our last conversation.
The abyss once had form, but then dissipated. And yet, traces of its existence endured. Each fragment, thirsting for power, spread dark with no relent. My dear Chandra was one such fragment. A feeble, tiny thing that thirsted for power more than any other. Driven by insatiable lust for a worthy vessel. One day fire will fade, and dark will become a curse. Men will be free from death, left to wander eternally. Dark will again be ours, and in our true shape, we can bury the false legends of yore. Only, is this our only choice? Seeker of fire, coveter of the throne. Seek strength. The rest will follow.
After harnessing the power of the four fiery lords, the loose fragments of Manus, and understanding truly what it meant not only to be human, but what it means to be a ruler, we are granted a blessing to Vendrick's crown that represents our journey as a whole. And as we march onto the Throne of Want, confront Nashandra, easily defeating her with our newfound strength, a moment of peace is briefly interrupted by Uldir.
Many monarchs have come and gone. One drowned in poison, another succumbed to flame. Still another slumbers in the realm of earth. Not one of them stood here as you do now. You, conqueror of adversities. Give us your answer.
And finally, an answer is granted. As Uldir falls, so does our want, our longing for a new reign. We know what it means to be human in this moment. Turning our back on the Throne of Want, we turn our heads towards Drang Lake.
There is no path. Beyond the scope of light, beyond the reach of dark, what could possibly await us? And yet we seek it insatiably. Such is our fate.
There's a reason at the end of the Trilogy DLC we are granted a crown that wards off the effects of hollowing, but only as an individual. While we know this doesn't avert hollowing forever, it represents Dark Souls 2's most important lesson. Not a lesson in futility, but the lesson that each individual hollow, each individual story of each character is far more important than the grand narratives we are forced to believe are most important. Humans can't be reduced to tools in the Age of Fire's preservation. Humans are not born to be sacrificed. We aren't defined by chosen prophecies or as sacrificial lambs for the gods. Humanity is defined by their stories. And at the end of Dark Souls 2, as our protagonist relinquishes the throne of want to return to Drang Lake with no plan in mind, he returns to a world filled with stories. Stories of desperate merchants, worrisome fathers, ambitious daughters, failed knights, vagabonds, cartographers, scholars. Our protagonist returns to Majula filled with love and life we fought to bring together. Dark Souls 2's story isn't about the accumulation of strength. Yes, we become immensely powerful having conquered the 4 Lord Souls, having conquered the aspects of Manus left behind, but these are extremely small fragments of the souls once conquered already, now having dwindled in the entropy of time. Dark Souls 2 doesn't change or challenge the grand narratives of the game like the third and final installment. It teaches us between the inception of the world in Dark Souls 1 and its crescendo in Dark Souls 3 is a world of thousands if not millions of ordinary humans who could not change the world, and despite this, their stories were just as rich as any other. It reminds us, the player, that ordinary is not only okay, but extremely freeing and rich in the things that truly matter on an individual level, like relationships and the people around us.
It will grow on you, this place. Give it some time. Look at our new neighbours. How they fret over all and sundry. Oh, those were better days. Ah, dear me. It really takes me back. I'd forgotten how much comfort a little companionship can bring. Once I'd lost everything, but now I am grateful for what you have taught me.
Unlike Dark Souls 2, Dark Souls 3 commences during a period where the Age of Fire's repressive bureaucracy is at its crumbling point. No longer are the 4 Lord Souls present enough to even assert any influence upon the Hollows. What remains are burnt-out legacies of the Lords that maintain the fire-linking cycle without even understanding why, or given guidance by ineffable souls lingering since the inception of the Age itself. Instead, the fire is represented by the history of the Lords of Cinder and the tattered bureaucracy of Anor Londo. As you'd expect, this Anor Londo, and subsequently the setting for Dark Souls 3, has become home to powers that are deeply desperate to usurp the Age of Fire as it nears its end. Forces such as Londor, Sullivan, Dragon Whisperers in the form of Osiris, and so on, have all matured immensely since the early days of their emergence, and their power far beyond what they used to represent. And to add to this, we learn this land is at the cusp of a turning point. The chosen undead of this era, the Twin Princes, have rejected the choice to link the First Flame, with worthy contenders far and few between, likely due to the absence of the Great Lord Souls and a narrated push for humans to link the First Flame. But by divine intervention, bells were tolled, and from the ashes arose 5 previous Lords of Cinder, called back to the world to accept their position in relinking the First Flame. Surely the chosen lords of old would seek to renew their vows to the Age of Fire. Unfortunately and unexpectedly, this would never be the case, as 3 of the 4 lords reborn would choose against the ritual, having first-hand accounts of how redundant the action was and how the cycle of kindling the First Flame was cyclical and made no true difference. So the bells were struck for a final time, and from its ashes our protagonist is born. We are the undead of time since forgotten, who inevitably failed to link the First Flame given a second chance. As we make our way from the cemetery that housed our body, our road to redemption is presented to us early in the form of Ayudex Gundyr, a tragic figure who once held the power to link the First Flame, but arrived to find no Firekeeper present, and thus his journey prematurely ended. Believing in the mission, he would sacrifice his body to become the preliminary test to another chosen champion who could take on his duty at a further date. Time has clearly malformed and weakened Gundir's body by the time we arrive. A bloating pus has been made of his stagnant humanity, but as we kill Gundir and retrieve a coiled sword, we have formally taken Gundir's duty as our own and set our sights towards the Firelink Shrine to formally begin our journey once again. As our protagonists makes their way to the shrine, we are greeted by a firekeeper, and upon her request a bonfire is lit and we are guided towards a quaint being that sits atop 5 thrones. He calls himself Ludlith and proclaims he is one of 4 Lords of Cinder reborn to link the First Flame. Unlike his peers, he has accepted his position in the fire-linking cycle and gives us direction. If we truly are here for redemption and to end the stagnation of this era, we must link the First Flame by assuming the power of Lords. Unlike the previously spoken of Lord Souls of Dark Souls 2, however, we are no longer in search of Lord Souls. We are in search of the raw power of the Lords of Cinder and previous conquerors of the 4 Lord Souls from time since gone. Comparatively, our challenge in this world is far beyond the scattered essence of gods from eons ago. We are battling 4 lineal champions who individually claim the 4 Lord Souls to link the fire once themselves, each Lord of Cinder representing the power of all 4 lords in unique ways. Our journey has us winding through Lothric until we arrive in the Road of Sacrifices, facing the first of the 4 Lords of Cinder, the Abyss Watchers, the head of a pact of men known as the Undead Legion of Farron, a covenant influenced by the life of Artorias and specifically his battle against the Abyss. Faithful to this duty to a fault, after rising at the tolling of the divine bells, they found themselves marching towards the Abyss once again. But only this time the Abyss, much like it had with Artorias, had inflated their humanity via proximity, and the Legion bound by one soul would turn on each other, endlessly embroiled in an eternal conflict with their own humanity, unable to even consider their position in the relinking of the First Flame. As we approach their domain at the end of the Road of Sacrifices, we find them in this state. Our Ashen Champion carrying Gundir's mission and a chance at redemption would face them off, felling the Great Champion and then drawing from them their soul and also their crown. As we march forward, we enter the catacombs of Karthus. A darkness resides here that the Abyss Watchers had sealed away long ago. Carrying the Abyss Watcher's soul, we march forward and learn Karthus was a grand empire ruled over by a tyrannical king that was soon consumed by the Abyss, marking his own death spiral. The remnants of Karthus now represent themselves in skeletal forms, which is all explained when we find our way to the end of the catacombs and upon a goblet are transported to an abyss-like realm, confronting the king of Karthus himself, High Lord Wolnir. Defeating Wolnir finally proves our status as not just an inheritor of the Abyss Watcher's soul, but an extension of their inherited power too. With this we move forward into Irithyll, a land burdened with an ice not of this world, until we are granted passage to Irithyll's dungeon, where we find a kingdom with an eternally burning flame at its centre. This is Yorm's domain, the only recorded Lord of Cinder of giant heritage. Yorm was a descendant of none other than the Giant Lord of Dark Souls 2, and a champion so great he ruled over a kingdom of men. Upon his reawakening, Yorm would return to his old kingdom, sitting atop his throne, anguishing in the sacrifice he not only made, but also the sacrifice his countrymen who trusted him for protection would make as he linked the First Flame, having singed the capital and burned its residents. Yorm represents a monumental battle. He was no lowly undead, but carried the lineage of the most capable giant who once stood down Vendrick, acting as his karmic reflection. Eclipsing our protagonist in size, we learn of a special artifact once created by Yorm, left in the hands of a close ally and his countrymen as a check and balance against his power to reassure their trust in giants. This is also why Yorm linked the First Flame to begin with, as this was, in his mind, further reassurance his interests are linked to humans too. Our protagonist, while outmatched in sheer scale, would find the Storm Ruler, the blade created to conjure storms to dismantle even giants. Using this artifact, we'd bring down Yorm to his knees and take from him his soul and the power of a benevolent titan. Retracing our steps, we return to Irithyll to claim the final Lord of Cinder's soul, but before this we have to confront Pontiff Sullivan. If you've watched the Boss Rank series, you'll know that Sullivan's story is one drenched in immense power. As he harnessed the Chaos Flame's contemporary form in the profaned capital, the power of Anolondo's primary deity in Moonlight, the Deep representing the contemporary material form of the Dark Soul through his association and rule over the Church of the Deep, and mastered the sorcerous arts of the Painted World in which he was born native to. Sullivan's might, while bargained and manipulated for, represented the zenith of the antagonistic forces present in this world more than anything or anyone else in the entire trilogy. In the grand narrative of Dark Souls 3, Sullivan's plan for creating a new era was the most calculated and likely to succeed. It began far before we even entered the picture, during a period in which he raised an army of followers and knights to assert his dominance through Lordran, capturing the soul of Gwyndolin and Anolondo, and proclaiming himself ruler of the highest political office in the lands, and finally having shepherded Aldrich, a being able to even consume the brightest soul of gods, he promised a new era where the darkness antagonistic to the Age of Fire would finally suffocate it, until all that remained was the dark, and the cycle of fire would be no more. As the final obstacle to Aldrich, the final Lord of Cinder required to bring home the old rulers, this was going to be the most important challenge to solidify the Ashen Champion as the real main protagonist of this era. And soon enough, as we venture through Sullivan's church, we battle. Seeking not to squander our redemption, our protagonist fights through everything that represents the Age of Fire's suffocation. Our protagonist, still believing himself a champion of the Age of Fire, finally gets the upper hand over Sullivan, until he finally falls and his soul fills our protagonist's body. We are now ready to face Aldrich and Anolondo. Aldrich was a priest that once was beholden to the Age of Fire. His tenure would have him rise the bureaucracy of the Age of Fire until he was appointed to the highest station of a new chapter built on the study and suppression of the Deep. While mysterious to begin with, we learned the Deep would come to represent the contemporary form of the Dark Soul and the Abyss, and much like the Abyss of old, would have a deep corrupting effect on the humanity of those in its proximity. Aldrich and his deacons were no exception, and soon, without realising it, Aldrich would begin to hunger for souls, a hunger that would have him obsessed with consuming as many souls as possible. While initially troubling to the Age of Fire, his rise would also coincide with the dwindling of the first flame of his own era, and thus his hunger would be encouraged and facilitated by Anolondo to eventually harbour enough power to link the first flame, a task he would eventually enact. However, much like the others, on rebirth he would grow apathetic towards the Age of Fire's mission, and with the guiding hand of a new rising star, Pontiff Sullivan and the remnants of the Church of the Deep, notably the residing Archdeacon MacDonald, Aldrich would be convinced to become a vehicle for a new philosophy on the order of the world, one of the Deep, an era to succeed the Age of Fire. Aldrich, reared by Sullivan, would be set upon the bureaucracy of Anolondo, wreaking havoc over the kingdom of gods and consuming their souls for good. Having defeated Sullivan, we arrive in Anolondo soon after these events, where Aldrich has consumed the soul of Gwyndolin. While still in Aldrich's early days when compared to what he was supposed to become, this battle not only has our protagonist confront a Lord of Cinder, but also the soul of an immensely powerful first-generation god, directly lineating from Gwyn. Our protagonist has journeyed far too long to be stopped, and soon Aldrich would fall, and with that, the risen Lords of Cinder of the ages since gone are brought back to the Firelink Shrine. However, there is still one more soul we require before confronting the first flame, the soul of a champion that was initially destined to stand in our position as we do today, this of course being the apathetic twin princes of Lothric. And so we set our sights on Lothric for the final time, battling through a kingdom with a rich legacy of important kings, queens and knights of the Age of Fire. We are given an audience with Lothric and Lorien, the twin princes bound by one soul.
Oh dear, another dogged contender. Welcome, unkindled one, purloiner of cinders. Mind you, the mantle of Lord interests me none. The fire-linking curse, the legacy of lords, let it all fade into nothing. You've done quite enough. Now have your rest.
Lothric and Lorien were born of King Osiris. Lothric in particular was groomed from birth to enact the ultimate sacrifice of linking the first flame when the time would come. Unfortunately, Lothric was born with severe birth defects, unable to even wield a blade made for this duty. Osiris believed the greatness of the kingdom was at stake and would spiral in his own mind, leaving a power vacuum in the kingdom of Lothric. Lorien, Lothric's elder brother and a far more physically capable knight who has killed an immensely powerful demon and rose to the zenith of Lothric's knightly bureaucracy, was a caring brother and, as the fires faded, joined his soul with Lothric to form into an entity that could indeed link the first flame. However, just as they were prepared to enact this ritual, something would change and they would proclaim the fire-linking cycle as a pointless endeavour, believing the ritual to be redundant in the grand scheme of the world. Some theorise this revelation came through the scholars of the Grand Archives within Lothric itself, and others suggest this was Sullivan's doing. But whatever the case may be, this would mark the world in an era of unprecedented stagnation, and the threats of the fire fading completely made far too real. Killing the twin princes for their soul would no doubt position us as not just an individually driven champion of Ash, but also a symbol of the Age of Fire's perseverance. Our protagonist, deeply beholden to this tradition and carrying the immensity of the souls accumulated thus far, finally bests the twins, and with that, the key to the kiln of the first flame is finally granted. And as we enter the final arena, we are faced with the dwindling bonfire once erected by Gwyn when he had himself linked the first flame, and beside it a champion that represented every soul that has ever linked the first flame. This is the Soul of Cinder, and just like the era it has appeared in, it is a manifestation of the limbo the world has assumed due to Lothric's dismissal of the fire-linking cycle, reinforced by the apathy towards the Age of Fire, spearheaded by Sullivan, Londor, and other growing factions taking a dominant position in the post-God landscape. While the world squabbled over who would link the first flame and if the first flame was worth relinking at all, something peculiar was happening at the kiln. In most cases, the first flame is defended by a previous inheritor or agents of the previous lord, such as Gwyn in Dark Souls 1 and the Throne Watchers in Dark Souls 2. But in the final installment, we learn it is the total amalgamation of all chosen undeads who have linked the flame before that now stand in its defense. From a lore-based perspective, the Soul of Cinder represents the final power check for the chosen undead to ensure they host within them a bright enough soul to link the first flame. But with how much time has elapsed, the previous chosen undead who linked the flame before has dwindled, and thus the flame itself has constructed a new champion in desperation to protect the kiln. And by extension, the Soul of Cinder is a representation of the first flame's power in a world where its relevance is waning. The Soul of Cinder sources its power from the first flame, and after the thousands of cycles between Dark Souls 1 and 3, the first flame is becoming incredibly dull. We get the most stark example of this from the visual effect difference in linking the first flame from Dark Souls 1 and 3. The first game burns extremely bright, whereas the final game is a tiny little ember. The first flame is dying, its source of power, no matter who or how it's linked, is turning powerless. Thus, despite the Soul of Cinder being representative of all those before it, it still sources its power from a shrine that is literally symbolised now as ash, not a flame. This is why the Firelink Greatsword specifically relates its strength to a fading flame and the power that sourced the Soul of Cinder as a momentary illumination. All this is being said because the Soul of Cinder, while fighting us with the abilities and powers of the Chosen Undead from time since gone, and even taking the form of Gwyn in its final phase, is not representative of their combined power. It's more so symbolic of the First Flame's memory manifest in order to defend itself. And as we face down the Soul of Cinder and confront the memory of the one who started it all, we, in a single-minded spree for redemption, choose to link the First Flame. And as its embers envelop our protagonist, having realised themselves as a true champion of Ash given a second chance, our champion of Ash having faced down challenges far beyond just the 4 Lord Souls mentioned in the previous entries, having confronted figures who harboured the power to change the world, and even faced a true chosen undead who was supposed to be here instead of us, is far greater than the protagonist who conquered the twisted and dwindling Lord Souls of Dark Souls 2. But in this moment, as our protagonist is finally given a chance to sit and think, ask themselves if this was all worth it, or are we just preserving a dying world due to an outdated legend created by gods who have long since disappeared from this world? And as the sun rises again, our protagonist dreams if things could have been different. As mentioned before, Dark Souls 3 houses most of the contentious factions in the entire trilogy. As the Age of Fire's facade of being the quote-unquote correct path for humanity is crumbling before the population's eyes, the world once blanketed by a fiery sun is now mostly resembled as ash. Fire is fading and its source is reaching its wick. However, as we will learn from the later games, the battle against the Age of Fire's hegemony began far before the events of Dark Souls 3. In fact, it can be traced all the way back to Gwyn's own premiership over the Age of Fire, where a little land known as Ulasil would house what we know as Manus, which was more likely the most prominent aspect of the Furtive Pygmy, the very being that once held the Dark Soul in its entirety during the precipice of the New World. While we'll explore the story of the Furtive Pygmy for our entries in Dark Souls 1, we know the Furtive Pygmy would be the progenitor of men and the being responsible for the humanity of all men, as humanity in its most primal form is a portion of the Dark Soul shared amongst the Furtive Pygmy's children, and a signifier for the age that was supposed to supersede the Age of Fire naturally. We learn Gwyn as he saw his Age of Fire dwindling and seeing within the children of the Furtive Pygmy the power to overthrow his era, much as he did with the Everlasting Dragons for the Age of Fire, was desperate not to let the fire fade and thus branded humanity with the dark sign in exchange for positions of authority in the Age of Fire. And without them knowing it, it bound their dark soul to the Age of Fire and thus to its preservation. Again, we'll delve deeper into this history for Dark Souls 1, but what's important to know here is that not all beings were able to be misled by Gwyn, as a certain primordial serpent known as Karth and a being of ancient origin knew of Gwyn's folly and deception, and would awaken within the Furtive Pygmy a rage that would transform him into Manus, to terrorise the Age of Fire in an attempt to correct history. Gwyn would win this war, and subsequently other wars related to Karth's campaign to undo the Age of Fire. However, long after Gwyn's demise, while the Age of Fire's presence weakened, Karth never forgot his mission, and by Dark Souls 3 his final act would come in aiding in the creation of Londor, a land far from the walls of Lothric and Anor Londo that believed hollowing was an inherently good thing, as it was the result of the Dark Soul pushing back against the confines of the Dark Sign. Londor would turn into a rival kingdom, and within its walls the banner of the Hollows were raised far higher than the legacy of the Age of Fire. At the height of this institution were the 3 Dark Sisters, missionaries for Karth that knew now was the time to strike the Age of Fire and usurp the flame to commence an Age of Hollows, correcting history's course. With this being said, our protagonist in this entry rises from the ashes of the cemetery, and just like the Ashen One spoken of earlier, believes their mission is to link the First Flame in order to redeem themselves and their previous failure to do so. But our protagonist in this story is a little more adventurous and less single-minded. As they pass through Gundyr and are introduced to the Firekeeper, they find themselves wandering Lothric with a keen interest in the world, until they are met with a figure that calls himself Yol. Yol is happy to see us, and even offers his services to us for our company. He's mysteriously eager to know that we are of Ash, and asks us to meet him back in the Firelink Shrine. Our protagonist journeys promptly back, and is greeted by Yol once again. Yol's services, we learn, is to draw our strength through our dark sign. He explains our dark sign holds a true power, and those of the dark sign hold a special power, a power he will help us realise. If power was what we lacked in our last failed attempt at linking the first flame, this may be exactly what we need to make a real difference. Our protagonist continues their journey just as the Ashen One had from the previous entry, until they meet Henri and Horace, travellers with a vendetta against Aldrich. Our protagonist, far more social than our previous protagonist, speaks to Henri, and again, just like Yol, agrees to meet them in Firelink Shrine, showing great empathy towards their story and trauma associated with Aldrich. After facing down the Abyss Watchers with the strength granted to us by Yol, we are finally given entrance to the catacombs of Karthus. But instead of feeling a sense of dread like our previous protagonist, something feels far more intimate here. The darkness is not all too unfamiliar to our new protagonist. As we make our way through, we are greeted by Henri again, but this time she's in distress. Henri is alone, and Horace, her bodyguard, has been separated via an unfortunate trap. Agreeing we will find Horace for her, our protagonist never really does find Horace, and thus Henri follows in our stead as we pave our way through to Irithyll after besting Wolnir. As we travel through Irithyll, still set on linking the first flame, again we find Henri at an impasse.
Oh, I thought it might be you. Good to see you. I never managed to find Horace. But my duty must be done, even alone, as an unkindled Lord Seeker.
With priorities aligned, we face Sullivan and open the path to Anolondo and to Aldrich. But before then, we return to Firelink Shrine to check up on our good friend Yol, and perhaps seek even greater strength. But as we approach Yol, we feel as if something has changed. These feelings are deemed accurate when we find Yol's lifeless body. Our dear friend has died. In the shadows, we spy a figure. Seeking answers, we approach her.
Oh, prithee, art thou good Yol's master? I am Uria of Londor, a close friend of his. Thanks to thee, Yol's soul is redeemed. Allow me to express my gratitude in his stead. Another matter. Thou'rt a lord, art thou not? Bearer of the dark sigil, and our Lord of Hollows. For the time thou remainst our Lord, we of Londor shall serve thee. And I, of course, am also thine. The Age of Fire was founded by the old gods, sustained by the linking of the fire. But the gods are no more, and the all-powerful fire deserveth a new heir. Our Lord of Hollows, it shall be, who weareth the true face of mankind.
Yol was a missionary of Londor, that much we knew, but we now learn what it means to be of Londor, what it means to be human, and what it means to link the first flame. Uria dismantles our worldview and puts a new one in perspective. The Age of Fire is dwindling, and a new lord must rise, not of fire, but of hollows. The very same presence Yol has taught us is intrinsic to our innate strength and our nature as humans. We are assured we can choose our fate rather than let it be chose for us by assuming a lord of a different moniker, not of cinders, but of hollows, a lord of men rather than a servant of gods.
Knowest thou of a maid named Anri? She is hollow, and will join thee in wedlock. A fellow of mine guides her at this moment. When the time is ripe, thou mayst make thy salutations. For what lord taketh no spouse?
We now know what we must do, thus we travel the same path as our last protagonist, but this time with a different purpose. And after killing the Lords of Cinder and the Twin Princes, we go on to take advantage of Henri's vulnerability and trust in us by conducting the ritual of betrothal, and from her we gain the last aspects of the Dark Sigil, unifying ourselves as a true Lord of Hollows, and harbouring a strong enough aspect of the Dark Soul to contest the Age of Fire as a champion of Londor. And finally, just as the previous protagonist had done, we are finally given an audience with the Soul of Cinder. But this time, as he stumbles and assumes the memories of Gwyn, we fight Gwyn with the power of generations of men who once sought to stand him down many times over. And as he falls, we touch the first flame, but this time we let our dark sigil suffocate it for good. Yuria and the people of Londor stand to watch as we rise as a new king born of the synthesis of Gwyn's failed eternal kingdom and the humanity of those who were promised a kingdom of their own. The Lord of Hollows, while having to challenge the same bosses as the previous Ashen One, is distinctly more powerful as the Lord of Hollows is everything the Ashen One was, but also enriched by bringing to life the innate power of their dark soul through a culture that has studied and learned of its mechanisms far before we even arrive in the game. This protagonist is not just a champion over the Lords of Cinder, but the endpoint of Kart's eon-long mission to correct the timeline for good. Battered, bruised, and at the cusp of hollowing, our introduction to the Soul series has us play the part of a human captured and left to be forgotten within the Undead Asylum. We learn the Undead Asylums were institutions created by Gwyn and subsequently Lordran to hold the hollowed population, likely as an initial attempt to preserve the Age of Fire's image as the dominant and eternal ruling structure. We know there were a variety of undead asylums, as the one the Chosen Undead is found in is actually referred to as the Northern Asylum. So these institutions were widespread, and we were likely one of thousands of humans who had succumbed to the Halloween curse, exiled and hidden far away from the world. As the Chosen Undead is present in Dark Souls 1, a point in the timeline where gods were more than just mythical stories deformed to history, Lordran, and thus the highest point of the Age of Fire's political authority, was still present, and alongside it so were the gods, the real primordial gods in their flesh. While Gwyndolin, son of Gwyn, was left truly in charge of the kingdom cloaked in a false sun, we know other deities such as Lloyd and Fina, Guinevere, and even Gwyn himself still resided materially in this world, ruling over a variety of other continents as Lordran's devolved powers. For example, All-Father Lloyd established himself in Thoroland to act as a bastion for the Age of Fire's fundamentalist religious wing. From it were birthed the Way of the White and bastions for upholding the old order of the gods. He's referred to in common tense as Gwyn's uncle, a direct kin. This is relevant to the Chosen Undead as we learn the governing powers of Dark Souls 1 were still the powers that came to prominence during the precipice of the Age of Fire, and thus the ruling powers knew explicitly well the Curse of Hollowing was not a mysterious ailment, but rather the result of Gwyn's choice to brand humanity, and thus all humans with the Dark Sign, and sacrifice himself to subvert the natural turning of ages. The Age of Fire was inherently tied to the First Flame, a source of power that allowed Gwyn to overturn the Age of Ancients, an age classified in terms of redundancy, injected with the abundance of life through the First Flame and the primordial Lord Souls that came as spontaneous revelations in a world that didn't even know death. However, much like the heat of our own world, the world of Dark Souls was also bound by a natural entropy of sorts, a promise that Gwyn's age would one day darken down into a redundant and dull state, ready for a new order to rise just as Gwyn's had during the first moments of the Age of Fire. The age succeeding Gwyn's was of course promised to humans and their own ordained ruler, the true bearer of the Dark Soul known as the Furtive Pygmy, the fourth forgotten primordial lord who, much like Nito and Izalith, actually aided Gwyn's own battle against the Age of Ancients with the knowledge that the course of nature would favour them in time. The Furtive Pygmy, much like Gwyn, had separated his own Lord Soul to create pygmies who would become the ancestors to all humans. Ordered to rally beside Gwyn, the pygmies would find a home within the Age of Fire. Some even granted stations of political significance, such as the Four Kings, and of course the Pygmy Lords of the Ringed City. However, Gwyn, at the back of his mind, always knew the same course of nature that allowed the emergence of his own age would one day cause his own to dwindle, and rightfully saw humans and the bearers of the Dark Soul as a threat. And as the fire of his age began to show signs of waning, instead of showing humility and acceptance, acted in desperation and hubris, secretly branding the bearers of the Dark Soul, the Pygmies, with the Dark Sign, an indelible mark that tied humanity to the Age of Fire, ensuring those of the Dark would be tied to the First Flame, and thus its dwindling would also force their own bodies and minds to deteriorate. This was the perfect material condition for Gwyn to preach the importance of the Age of Fire, even contradictorily to the Pygmies, arguing the preservation of the First Flame was inherently good even for those that bared the Dark Soul, pointing towards hollowing as a negative effect of rejecting the Age of Fire and acting in their own nature as beings of the Dark. Without the Pygmies realising it, it was in fact Gwyn that forced this state of hollowing into the beings of the Dark in the first place, granting them the Dark Sign as a show of loyalty, and in turn granted lordly positions. But without realising it, it was the first sign of Gwyn's longing to eternally subjugate humans as kindling fodder for his own Age of Gods. You have to ask yourself why the Dark Sign is literally a dark centre with an imprisoning event horizon of flame. This was a cage. This would all be solidified when Gwyn, in his last act of defiance to nature, would burn his own soul to the First Flame to artificially prolong the Age of Fire, and behind him he would leave a campaign of propaganda that moralised the act of self-sacrifice in preserving the Age of Fire, building into the cultural fabric of the world the notion of chosen undeads who would have to follow in his own actions when the flames would inevitably dwindle once more, ultimately ensuring his dreams of an eternal kingdom for the god class that commanded the Age of Fire. So why is this relevant to the Chosen Undead? Well, if you haven't guessed it yet, we as the protagonist in Dark Souls 1 are one of these pygmy descendants during a period in which Gwyn's Lord Soul is burning thin, meaning Gwyn's propaganda is more relevant now than it has and will ever be. To return to our playable protagonist, we are one of these hollowing humans, and after an encounter with a hearty champion of Astora, we are reminded of our duty as faithful servants to the Age of Fire. Oscar of Astora tells us,
"There is an old saying in my family, thou who art undead art chosen, and thine exodus from the undead asylum maketh pilgrimage to the land of ancient lords. When thou ringeth the bell of awakening, the fate of the undead thou shalt know."
Oscar is a perfect example of Gwyn's campaign. He is a human, a bearer of the Dark Soul who believes only one thing to be true. The only way to undo the dwindling conditions of this world is to follow a prophecy set by our god rulers, to journey to Lordran and inevitably meet with the Kingseeker and set down a path to sacrifice themselves in Gwyn's place. Our protagonists, lost of all memory of their past life, instilled by the words of a seemingly altruistic figure, would make their way out of the undead asylum, coming up against the asylum demon, reckoning with a first-generation demon enslaved by Gwyn to act as a first obstacle to the hollows of the undead asylum. As we know now from the words of Oscar, these asylums served two functions: the aforementioned imprisonment of Hollows, but also as a proving ground for a champion to rise amongst the bearers of humanity to contest the kiln of the First Flame and take Gwyn's mantle, preserving the Age of Fire. After making their way out of the asylum, the chosen undead speaks to yet another prophecy-instilled Hollow, a crestfallen man, ultimately feeding us the same prophecy as Oscar, but with a far more desolate tone. Our protagonist learns again of the importance of bells, but this time is given better direction as to where to go. Our protagonist, torn between honouring the benevolent Oscar's optimism and the pessimism of this crestfallen knight who cannot even remember his own name, picks up their sword, or staff, but definitely not a bow, and ventures on. Our protagonist, passing through the ruins of a burg and a parish, eventually faces off against the Bell Gargoyle, yet another first-generation demon and spoil of war for Gwyn after the War of Izalith, now enriched by Lordran's armaments. One turns to two, and as they fall, we ring the first bell. One to go. The next would not be so easy, as soon our protagonist is trudging through muck and poison until eventually a true daughter of Izalith is contested in the form of Quelaag, the zenith of Izalith's chaos, something we only truly understand the relevance of in later installments. Eventually ringing both bells, we return to our crestfallen comrade. Our protagonist's attention, however, is sidetracked by a serpent who has risen from a shrine. This is Kingseeker Frampt. Frampt represents the key divergence in the two paths our protagonist can take. This entry follows Frampt, which is fitting in many ways because it's intentionally the more obvious route you can actually take, once again playing into the crafted path created by Gwyn's authority to funnel humans towards the rekindling of the First Flame. Frampt naturally reinstates the undead prophecy and gives us the clear route to proving we are in fact the chosen undead, pointing us towards Sen's fortress, Anno Londo, the procurement of the Lord Vessel, and the importance of consolidating the four great Lord Souls into ourselves so that we can in turn burn as close to Gwyn's own brightness when we link the First Flame in his stead. So that's exactly what the Chosen Undead does, contesting Sen's fortress and passing the trial of the Iron Golem, an automaton made from the bones of an everlasting dragon in the shell of an iron giant, likely forged by the famous giant blacksmith that first helped Gwyn create weapons for gods themselves, and eventually finding their way to Anno Londo, the land of the Lords. As Dark Souls 1 is also canonically before the events of Dark Souls 3, we learn a few important things from later Anno Londo, such as the fact that the Chosen Undead, while likely having faced off against Ornstein and Smaug, may have in fact fought a version of Ornstein that may have been either an illusion or survived the encounter, the latter being unlikely as Ornstein and Smaug were likely to have fought till death to protect the Lord Vessel and the residing illusion of Guinevere. In any case, the Chosen Undead breaks Ornstein's lightning and pierces the overinflated executioner Smaug, his sinister laughs going silent, signalling the Chosen Undead's victory and our audience with Guinevere, formally accepting their chosen position and setting off the dominoes to consolidate the Lord Souls of Gwyn's peers that fought alongside him during the War of Ancients against the Everlasting Dragons. So our protagonist sets off, tracking Nito, first of the dead, to the catacombs embroiled in grave-tending duties, but with a portion of his power having been stolen by Pinwheel, and later Seath, a beneficiary of a portion of Gwyn's own great soul of sunlight within the Duke's archives, seeking to materialise the immortality he lacked and his peers coveted, and then Izalith within Lost Izalith, having mutated into the Bed of Chaos, and at the tail end of a protracted war with Anno Londo, after failing to create her own First Flame, likely as an attempt to undo its waning influence, and of course finally the Great Four Kings, who just like Seath were granted a portion of Gwyn's soul to govern his devolved territory, now left in the rubble and water of New Londo deep within the abyss. It's rare in these games that we are able to battle true gods canonised as myth in later games, But in Dark Souls 1, we actually get to face off against the primordial bearers of the Lord Souls in these encounters. While there are caveats to how in their prime the Lord Soul bearing gods were, these versions of the Lord Soul wielders far exceed the spiritual successions of later installments, such as that of Dark Souls 2 with the Rotten, Iron King, and so on. And in many ways, the journey for the chosen undead in the first game is the most testing for any throughout the trilogy. With this in mind, it's important to also mention, of course, the story of Manus and Ulasil. In Dark Souls 1's only DLC, we play the story of a time-travelling hero who follows the path of Artorias. Artorias was a champion of Gwyn's formal Round Table of Knights. His duties were bound by the most important facet of Gwyn's preserved hegemony, to suppress the rogue aspects of the Abyss. However, we learn Artorias had fallen short, and upon the request of a maiden and resident of Ulasil who has travelled into the future, we are told the world seeks a new champion to continue his story. We learn the reason for this relates to Artorias' corruption at the hands of the Abyss. Artorias' final mission had him sent to Ulasil to confront a darkness only seen once before during the precipice of the Age of Fire, when a lord was born beside Gwyn, Nito and Izalith, known as the Furtive Pygmy. Taking up the challenge, we are dragged into the past, entering the world of Dark Souls not long after Gwyn had branded humanity with the Dark Sign. Our journey in Ulasil is a Dark Souls historian's wet dream, as we are given first-hand accounts of the Age of Fire during its prime, where civilizations existed that were inherently unmilitarized, as Gwyn's hegemony was strong enough to give peace to the subjects of his rule. This unmilitarized nature would also mean this rising darkness would easily consume Ulasil, explaining why Artorias would be sent to deal with the Scourge. After following Artorias' path, we finally come to Ulasil's township, where the injured and corrupted Artorias stands waiting. Our chosen undead, already harbouring the immensity of the Lord Souls, grants Artorias his final rest, and it wouldn't be long until our champion is face to face with Manus himself. Manus is the most prominent aspect of the Dark Soul, likely being what was left of the Furtive Pygmy after he had divested his soul to the Pygmy Lords. In many ways, Manus is a reflection of Gwyn after having divested his own soul to Seath, the Four Kings, and the other gods. And while we cannot fight Gwyn in his prime, we are by power scale in many ways fighting the antithesis to contemporary Gwyn in Manus, the largest amalgamation of the Dark Soul, bar of course the ending sequence of Gale in Dark Souls 3, explaining how a being such as Artorias, specialised in countering the Abyss, would also fall victim. Our chosen undead, powered by the legacy of the Furtive Pygmy's contemporaries, finally brings him down, and as we return to our own timeline, our champion knows what is left to be done. So after our chosen undead canonically defeats these Lord Soul bearers, they open the door to the first kiln and descend the ethereal stairs once walked by one other, and in the foreshadowing ashes of the kiln of the first flame makes the short journey to the kiln itself, and within stands a man that could induce the fear of biblical angels to an atheist, Gwyn himself. Undeterred, our chosen undead faces Gwyn in a battle to finish the ritual once set in motion by Gwyn. Of course, Gwyn in this moment is a dwindle husk of his former self, his soul having already been spread thin through his kingdom, granting it to Seath and the Four Kings to govern in his absence. Furthermore, Gwyn's own radiance has been brought to a true dimness, so dim in fact even his signature lightning is nowhere to be found. Once again realising the nature of the world's new cycle, Gwyn had sacrificed his own life force to the first flame. Entropy has dwindled it thin, and we are here having galvanised the souls of his peers through Izalith Nito, but also consolidated his own soul by defeating the Four Kings and Seath, ready to set the clock back to zero. And that's exactly what we do. We defeat the great King of Kings, fusing Gwyn's soul into our own body, but this time enriched by the other three Lord Souls that defeated the immortal dragons, beginning a new age and representing the first pygmy-born human to take on the mantle of the Lord of Cinder. In games franchises, mythology and world-building fundamental to the laws of the game are often left in books, dialogue, and description. But Dark Souls 1, in retrospect, having played through the other two games, in many ways lets us play the history of the universe firsthand. We are up against true first-generation gods who wield Lord Souls in their most primordial form, souls that are so excessive in power, their stories having dwindled to the passage of time, still playing immense important roles even up until the end of the trilogy. Nito is greater than the Rotten, in the same way the true Gwyn is greater than the Soul of Cinder. As we learn, the passage of time has a material effect on the potency of both the first flame and subsequently the souls that are used to fuel it. And by Dark Souls 3, where the flames have dwindled to such a quiet state that the world is now represented by ash, and the Firelink ritual now a small ember when compared to the brilliant flame of the first game, assures us the souls of fire lose their potency with time. This is precisely why Gwyn's direct successor, the chosen undead of Lordran who heeded Fram's message, is David in the most Goliath of situations. The gods of Lordran are the gods of mythology and thus of mythical proportions. And by association, the chosen undead who canonically force their souls onto their self is the story of a champion the history of the game seldom offers enough credit to. We are misled to believe the chosen undeads of time hitherto followed in Gwyn's footsteps, as in truth a great majority of Firelinkers from this point were human, and in many ways humans didn't follow Gwyn's footsteps, they followed the unnamed, unhistoried footsteps of an undead champion that rose from the stone walls of an asylum. When we speak of the journey for the conventional Lords of Cinder, if we bar Gwyn, the greatest of them all was no doubt the chosen undead of Lordran. A champion who did what even the everlasting dragons combined could not, face down three gods of gods who directly held the truest aspect of the most powerful sources of energy at a time closest to their revelation, the Lord Souls, and thus our hero of Lordran ranks here on the list, right behind one other, who not only shared the chosen undead's timeline, but represented a different narrative to the world altogether. In the last entry, I spoke about the story of the chosen undead who journeyed past the Northern Undead Asylum, rang both bells, and was granted an audience with Framt. And while the Dark Lord is that very same person, the Dark Lord actually represents a secret alternative to the mainstream path of least resistance protagonist, as instead of following in Gwyn's ordained story for humanity, the Dark Lord finds something far more special that would change the trajectory of the protagonist for good. Much like the chosen undead, the Dark Lord finds themselves in the clutches of the Northern Undead Asylum. Lost of mind, they are saved by Oscar, eventually finding themselves in Lordran and the Firelink Shrine, going on to ring the bells of awakening as suggested by the benevolent Oscar, seeing no reason to distrust his narrative at this point. But instead of returning to the Firelink Shrine, the Dark Lord finds themselves lost to the winding of Lordran's roads, eventually ending up in the dark green pastures of the Darkroot Gardens. There's a history here that is unbeknownst to our Dark Lord, a history of an ancient deity often forgotten by records themselves, but so relevant to the new path the Dark Lord was about to embark on. After a brief bargain with a blacksmith who cheers on the fire-linking prophecy, our protagonist is granted a passage to a shrine guarded by a great grey wolf. This of course is no challenge for our protagonist, and from limping to death, the wolf falls. But the wolf's soul wouldn't be the only spoil, as behind this great wolf was a gravestone, worn away with what seems like eons of attrition. Under the rubble, our protagonist finds a peculiar ring emanating with an aura of corruption, a symbol of an old covenant held by one of Gwyn's greatest champions, Knight Artorias, a man now only known in terms of tragedy, the most famous early victims of the Abyss and the mysterious captor of Ulasil. Much like the chosen undead, our protagonist is too a descendant of Pygmy, and so the internal pull of darkness nourishes a part of our protagonist that had lay forcefully dormant and clouded by the greed of Gwyn and an ancient betrayal, the Dark Sign. The pull of the void keeps our protagonist from the Firelink Shrine. A one-sightedness actually brings our protagonist to New Londo, a water-filled hell, the ancient resting place for the Four Kings, perhaps the most famously trusted of Gwyn's pygmy lords, so trusted in fact that Gwyn gave them a part of his own soul so that they could govern a kingdom to shadow the kingdoms of the gods. The aptly named New Londo was of course derived from Anor Londo for this reason. New Londo in these early days was prosperous, trusted, and had a degree of political autonomy seldom granted during Gwyn's premiership in Anor Londo. While Anor Londo stood as the home of the gods governed by the gods, New Londo became the home of the pygmies and their descendants, humans. Our protagonist, as they walk through New Londo, would begin to ponder how such a site of ruin could exist at such a scale, not a stone throw away from the land of gods. Filled with ghosts, it's clear whatever happened here was no accident or natural disaster. The people died here with an unresting vengeance. Thankfully, our protagonist quelled the vengeance with a transient curse they kept as a keepsake from an earlier defeated foe. As the protagonist climbs the broken terrain, they are greeted by a man in red. He calls himself Ingrid and relieves us of our intrigue of what New Londo is. He paints the picture of Lordran's second city, a city led by the Four Kings of pygmy ancestry, ordained by Gwyn himself and granted a portion of Gwyn's soul to govern with loyalty but independence, an independence that would bite Gwyn in the back. As while the Age of Fire was able to subdue the first wave of the Abyss in Ulasil, slaying Manus, it wouldn't be the end of the Abyss's revolution, as the catalyst that caused Ulasil's destruction was not Manus. Manus was only the vehicle. The true catalyst was a serpent named Karth. Karth was driven by a very different moral compass than Frampt. Karth not only knew the history of Gwyn's betrayal to the furtive pygmy and subsequently his descendants, but also tasked himself with correcting that history. Karth began his task in the shadows, originally seeking out the furtive pygmy itself in the Abyss to teach it of Gwyn's treachery and how Gwyn had tricked his children, parts of his own devolved dark soul, into accepting the dark sign, hoping its anger to this revelation would consume Gwyn's Age of Fire and bring upon the rightful Age of the Dark, the Age of Men. The furtive pygmy would act as Karth intended, taking on a new form, a form known as Manus, a violent projection of the dark soul, ready to change Gwyn's authority. But Manus's campaign was cut short after dying at the hands of a mysterious champion, his dark soul now completely split across the world. Undeterred, Karth, still in the shadows, set his sights on a new mission. If Manus could not singularly take down the Age of Fire, then perhaps he needed to galvanize the entirety of the Dark Soul and thus humanity against the Age of Fire. And sometime later, Karth would find himself in the company of the Four Kings in New Londo. If he could convince the Four Kings, beneficiaries of Gwyn's own devolved soul, then a movement could arise that could realise these new ambitions. But Karth did not only come with the words of Gwyn's treachery, he also came bearing a gift, the Art of Life Drain, a power that allowed humans to rip the humanity from other humans to enrich and bloat their own dark soul. A promise of power, but also a means to weaponize the entirety of the dark soul against Gwyn. The Four Kings took well to Karth's words, but instead of acting in anger, they worked hard behind the scenes, building a coven of champions known as the Dark Wraiths, and granted them the Art of Life Drain under the party line of weaponizing the Dark Soul against the Age of Fire, until every human either joined them to fight this war, or were forced to forfeit their Dark Soul to those who did. The Dark Wraiths and the Four Kings, under the tutelage of a more reserved Karth, would go on to make immense leaps in this art. In the shadows, they built an army to rival Gwyn's Silver Knights. The Four Kings themselves would bloat with the power of humanity, ready to lead the charge. Unfortunately for the kings, however, Gwyn would learn of this brewing rebellion, and in one preemptive swoop would use the geography of the land against it and bury the entire kingdom in a flood of biblical proportions, wiping out almost every resident of New Londo. But of course, the four kings and a pocket of dark wraiths survived, and with Karth they clutched onto life deep below Earth in the Abyss. Ingward, a stationed observer, knew this, and granted us a means to drain New Londo and confront the four kings with the sole purpose of reclaiming a portion of Gwyn's Lord Soul. And so, our protagonist, taking well to Ingward's kindness in a world filled with threats of violence, still believes themselves to be a champion of the Age of Fire, and does just that, plunging into the Abyss protected by Artorias' covenant and facing the Four Kings. A challenge that supersedes anything reckoned with thus far, and as the kings fall, the Lord Soul is captured by our protagonist, but it feels a little different. Artorias' covenant stirs, and the quietness of the Abyss is interrupted by a serpent. We are inclined to immediately attack, but something primordial within the protagonist forces them to put their weapon away and approach the serpent.
Greetings, undead warrior. I am the primordial serpent, Darkstalker Karth. I can guide thee and illuminate the truth. The truth I shall share without sentiment. After the advent of fire, the ancient lords found the three souls, but your progenitor found a fourth, unique soul, the Dark Soul. Your ancestor claimed the Dark Soul and waited for fire to subside, and soon the flames did fade, and only dark remained. Thus began the Age of Men, the Age of Dark. However, Lord Gwyn trembled at the dark, clinging to his Age of Fire and in dire fear of humans, and the Dark Lord who would one day be born amongst them. Lord Gwyn resisted the course of nature by sacrificing himself to link the fire and commanding his children to shepherd the humans. Gwyn has blurred your past to prevent the birth of the Dark Lord. I am the primordial serpent. I seek to right the wrongs of the past, to discover our true Lord. But the other serpent, Frampt, lost his sense and befriended Lord Gwyn. Undead warrior, we stand at a crossroads. Only I know the truth about your fate. You must destroy the fading Lord Gwyn, who has coddled fire and resisted nature, and become the fourth Lord, so that you may usher in an age of dark.
In this moment, our protagonist is finally able to understand the stirring within, the illusions of the undead prophecy, the nature of humanity, the nature of men, the promise that humans were far greater than the positions they were born into under the Age of Fire. Humans are not servants, laborers, or the tools for the gods. Humans are Godbane, a force of nature and the rightful owners of this era. Our protagonist casts away the memories of Oscar, and in its place the generational anger of the furtive pygmy is instilled, and the ambitions of a Dark Lord are born. The protagonist willingly takes the art of life drain, shedding their shining armor for the blackness of the Abyss, and as the protagonist leaves the Abyss, they rise completely anew. Doing just as Karth had recommended, they hunt each and every Lord Soul remaining, and on the way there, draining the humanity of every victim, ripping humanity with a newfound bloodlust against the Age of Fire. This can also be extended to Manus, where our Dark Lord would also hunt Manus not with the purpose to end the Dark Souls rebellion, but understanding Manus wouldn't be enough, and in turn destroying Manus to capture as much of his own darkness with life drain to represent as much of the Dark Soul as possible. In this moment, unlike the chosen undead, the protagonist is not just powered by the fiery souls of gods, but invigorated with a mass of darkness appropriate for the station as a Dark Lord. Facing Gwyn is markedly easier for our budding Dark Lord, and as he collapses and our protagonist consumes the soul of Gwyn, our protagonist realizes themselves as the Dark Lord, not even giving a glimpse towards the First Flame's bonfire, and immediately turning towards Lordran to reign supreme as both the Slayer of Gods, but also the Chief of Humans. By all metrics, the story of the Dark Lord is greater than that of the Chosen Undead, as in the end of the game we know the Chosen Undead never realizes the inherent power of the Dark Soul, whereas the Dark Lord not only realizes the power of the Dark Soul, but arguably enriches it further than the Four Kings. And we know from future games, notably Dark Souls 3, the consumption of humanity often enriched the power of the wielder significantly, such as that of Aldrich, a power that gave them the right to link the First Flame on these merits alone. The Dark Lord in this moment, just like the Chosen Undead had done for future humans who would link the First Flame, would set in motion the path that would inevitably lead to Londor's rise, and as discussed, an alternative end to the trilogy altogether. We know whatever ending is truly canon, the world of Dark Souls is still bound to the fire linking cycle, meaning the Dark Lord in this format may have never happened, or alternatively and more likely, if a Dark Lord did ever rise, they were either defeated by a chosen undead of a future timeline to rekindle the First Flame, or the complexity of truly undoing Gwyn's Dark Sign curse had not been figured out yet, and thus the revolution dwindled in time. But in any case, one thing is for certain: the protagonists from the first game stand side by side as the true forgotten Goliaths of this universe, both just as important to the dialectic of Dark Souls cycle, both representing the inherent internal struggle of what it means to be human in the Dark Souls series.
Fire came to be, and with it, disparity. Heat and cold, life and death, light and dark. Dark was seen as a curse. Shadow is not cast, but born of fire. And the brighter the flame, the deeper the shadow. Inherit fire and harness the dark. Such is the calling of a true leader.